Richard Lewis was a 42-year-old millionaire who had everything: wealth, power, and status. Yet, one fateful night, he realized that amidst all his luxuries, there was one thing money couldn't buy: an heir. Richard needed a child. Having failed twice at marriage, Richard had grown disillusioned with the idea of love. To him, love was nothing more than an illusion that brought nothing but heartache. But a child? A child was different, a legacy, an investment in his empire. Determined to avoid the complications of relationships, he decided to treat this as he would any other business deal, with total control and a clear contract. The next morning, Richard cruised the city streets in his sleek sports car, mulling over his plan. He needed someone willing to carry a child for him. No questions asked, no emotional entanglements, just a cold, straightforward arrangement. As he stopped at a red light near downtown, something caught his eye. A young woman sat on the sidewalk, hunched over a piece of tattered paper, drawing with intense focus. Her unkempt brown hair fell across her face, but her striking blue eyes shone through the grime and exhaustion. She seemed invisible to everyone passing by, yet Richard found himself oddly drawn to her. When the light turned green, he sped off, shaking his head. "Who sits on the sidewalk drawing like nothing else matters?" he muttered. But a few blocks later, the image of her lingered in his mind. Frustrated, he pulled into a parking lot, gripping the steering wheel as an idea began to form. "This is absurd," he said under his breath, but the thought persisted. Giving in to his instincts, Richard turned his car around and drove back. She was still there, leaning against the wall, focused on her makeshift canvas. Richard pulled up to the curb and rolled down his window, his voice brisk and commanding. "Hey you, come here." The young woman looked up, startled, her wary blue eyes locking onto his. She hesitated, clearly cautious of the sharply dressed man in the expensive car. "I'm not asking." "Come on, I don't have all day," he snapped, impatience seeping into his tone. Slowly, she stood and approached, her movements hesitant yet defiant. Up close, her thin frame and worn clothes spoke of a hard life, but there was a quiet strength in her posture. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice low but steady, her gaze unflinching. Richard studied her closely before speaking. "Get in. We'll go somewhere private to talk." She let out a dry laugh. "If you're thinking I'm that kind of woman, you're wrong." His brow furrowed with irritation. "Don't be ridiculous. I don't have time for that nonsense. I just want to talk. Get in the car, or stay here. It's your choice." Her hesitation lingered, but his commanding tone left little room for argument. Finally, she opened the door and slid into the passenger seat. The car ride was silent and tense, but Richard didn't seem bothered. He drove to a quiet cafe on the outskirts of the city, far from the bustling noise, and parked. Once seated at a corner table, Richard broke the silence. "What's your name?" "Stella Parker," she replied sharply, her suspicion evident. "But why does that matter?" "I need to know who I'm dealing with," he said calmly, leaning back in his chair. "Tell me, Stella, why do you sit on the sidewalk drawing, like nothing else matters?" She shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "What else am I supposed to do? I've lost everything. But that's none of your business." Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Fair enough. Let's get to the point. I want to make you an offer, something that could change your life." Her eyes narrowed. "What kind of offer?" "I want you to have a child for me." Stella blinked, her expression a mix of disbelief and confusion. "You're kidding, right?" "I'm entirely serious," he said firmly. "I'll cover all your expenses and provide full support throughout the pregnancy. When the baby is born, you'll receive a payment that will set you up for life." A nervous laugh escaped her lips as she crossed her arms. "This has to be a joke. Who does something like this?" "A man who knows what he wants and doesn't waste time," Richard replied, his tone cold and direct. "I'm not looking for love or commitment, Stella, just a child. No emotions. No complications. It's a straightforward deal." Stella stared at him, struggling to process his words. His detached logic unsettled her, leaving her torn between pride and the crushing weight of her reality. "This is insane," she finally said. No woman in her right mind would agree to this. Richard's demeanor remained calm, his gaze steady. No woman in your position would refuse, he said bluntly. I'm offering you a way out, security, stability, and a chance to rebuild your life. All I ask in return is something you already have, the ability to carry a child. Stella crossed her arms, trying to conceal the turmoil within her. Deep down, she knew Richard had a point. Every day was a battle for survival, yet the thought of giving up something so deeply personal for money left her feeling sick. And then what? She asked, her tone edged with skepticism. What happens after the baby is born? Richard leaned back slightly in his chair, his demeanor calm and measured. Once the baby is born, you'll receive a significant payment. Enough to start your life over. After that, you're free to go, no strings attached. No strings attached? She echoed, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. And I'm supposed to believe you won't change your mind and drag me to court later? Richard regarded her steadily. Stella, I'm a businessman. I don't make deals without ensuring all parties benefit. Everything will be outlined in a legally binding contract. Neither of us will be able to go back on the agreement. His words hung in the air as Stella absorbed them. The promise of stability, however fleeting, was tempting. She had nothing, not even a safe place to sleep that night. But the enormity of the decision loomed over her like a shadow. And what if I say no? She challenged, leaning forward slightly. Richard offered a faint, knowing smile. Then you go back to the streets. You keep struggling, enduring the cold and hunger. The choice is yours. His bluntness struck her like a slap. She wanted to despise him for being so cold, yet it was the truth of his words that stung the most. He had cornered her, and she knew it. Still, one question lingered. Why are you doing this? She demanded. A man like you, with all your money, why not just adopt or find one of those rich women who parade around with their perfect lives? Richard's expression shifted, his tone growing serious. Because I want something that's mine. An heir, my own flesh and blood. Adoption, or involving someone from my social circle, comes with complications I refuse to deal with. I want control, Stella, nothing more, nothing less. The cold precision of his answer unsettled her, making her look away. His honesty only deepened her sense of vulnerability. I need time to think, she said finally, grasping for some sense of control. Richard nodded, as if he had expected this. You have 24 hours. After that, don't bother contacting me. With that, he stood and walked toward the door without a backward glance. Stella watched him leave, feeling as though she was being pulled into a storm she might never escape. As she wandered through the streets, her thoughts swirled. Richard's words echoed in her mind, comfort, stability, a new life. Stella understood all too well what it meant to have nothing. The bitter cold of the night clung to her skin, a cruel reminder that tomorrow would bring the same struggles, scavenging for food, living in fear, and enduring the crushing humiliation of being invisible to everyone around her. Sitting on a park bench, she gazed at the overcast sky. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. Opportunities only knock once, and it's up to you to decide whether to seize them or let them slip away. But at what cost? She whispered to herself. The idea of having a child, even as part of a cold business arrangement, weighed heavily on her. It wasn't a decision to be taken lightly. But what if it was her only chance to escape the relentless cycle of misery? Meanwhile, Richard sat in his luxurious living room, reviewing the carefully crafted contract prepared by his lawyers. Patience wasn't his strength, but he knew Stella didn't have many options. If she refused, he would move on, simple and pragmatic. His thoughts were interrupted by the intercom buzzing. He picked it up, hearing the receptionist's voice. Stella Parker is here. Send her up, he said, his tone calm and measured. Moments later, the door opened and Stella stepped inside. Her eyes were tired, but filled with determination. I accept, she said bluntly, cutting to the chase. Richard stood, scrutinizing her. Her voice carried no hesitation. Her resolve was clear. Good. Let's make it official, he said, gesturing for her to take a seat. He placed the contract on the table in front of her. Stella picked it up and began to read. The terms were straightforward. Her needs would be fully provided for throughout the pregnancy, and she would receive a life-changing sum of money at the end. In return, she would relinquish all parental rights to the child. This feels final, she said softly. That's the intention, Richard replied evenly. And I hope it's what you want as well. Stella hesitated for a moment, taking a deep breath. Then, with firm resolve, she picked up the pen and signed her name in swift, deliberate strokes. The deal was done. Later that same day, Richard's assistant, Stephanie, escorted Stella to a sleek black car waiting at the building's entrance. As the car pulled away, Stella gazed out the window. The city, once oppressive and suffocating, now seemed to offer something entirely different, a glimmer of hope for a fresh start. The ride to Richard's mansion was mostly silent. Stella remained lost in her thoughts, but Stephanie tried to ease the tension. "You'll like the place," Stephanie said with a warm smile. "It's quiet, spacious, and most importantly, comfortable." The warmth in Stephanie's voice was a stark contrast to the cold, formal contract Stella had just signed. Stella nodded quietly, still trying to process everything that had transpired in the past few hours. When the car finally arrived, Stella's eyes widened at the sight before her. The large iron gates opened to reveal perfectly manicured gardens surrounding a mansion, an imposing structure of marble and glass that seemed just as cold and calculated as its owner, Richard. Stephanie guided her inside, and Stella barely had time to take in the lavish surroundings: crystal chandeliers, wide marble staircases, and furniture that looked straight out of a designer catalog. "This isn't my world," Stella thought, her mind racing. "But for now, it'll have to be. I'll show you to your room," Stephanie said with a smile. "It's one of the best suites in the house." Stella followed silently, entering a room that seemed like something out of a dream. A massive bed with soft linen sheets, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a bathroom bigger than any apartment she had ever lived in greeted her. "If you need anything, just call me. We're here to take care of you," Stephanie added before leaving her alone. Stella sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers grazing the soft sheets. Just yesterday, she had been sleeping on cold sidewalks, and now she was surrounded by unimaginable luxury. But as comfortable as the room was, there was an undeniable heaviness in the air. She knew she wasn't a guest here, she was part of a business arrangement. In the days that followed, Stella adjusted to her new life. Meals were promptly served, and doctors conducted her initial exams. Richard remained distant, focused on work and rarely appearing, except when he reviewed the progress reports Stephanie provided. One day, their paths crossed in the hallway. Stella had just finished a medical appointment when Richard, as composed as ever, approached her. "Are you okay?" he asked, his tone more out of duty than concern. Stella hesitated before answering. "Everything's as expected, I guess." He nodded, offering no further comment. Before leaving, he gave her one last glance. "If you need anything, ask Stephanie. I want you to be well." Stella couldn't decide if his words were genuine or simply a way to ensure the arrangement went smoothly, but the brief encounter lingered in her thoughts. Despite being treated like royalty, Stella couldn't ignore the growing doubts within her. One quiet evening, she stepped out onto the balcony of her room and looked out at the sprawling garden, bathed in moonlight. Everything felt so peaceful, so different from the harsh world she had known. "Am I doing the right thing?" she wondered, pulling her arms tightly around herself against the cold wind. The decision to carry a child, and then give it away, was becoming increasingly complicated for Stella. Despite the contract making it clear that she would have no rights to the child, she couldn't predict how she would handle the emotional aspects of the situation. From a distance, Richard observed her with quiet attention. He knew Stella was strong, but he also understood the emotional burden she was carrying. Despite his usual coldness, Richard found himself strangely curious about her. Who was she, this woman who had accepted such an unusual offer? And why couldn't he shake the feeling that she was more than just a part of his carefully crafted plan? One evening, Stella was in the living room, absent-mindedly flipping through a book from the shelf. Although she wasn't fond of classic literature, the peacefulness of the house and the smell of old books gave her a sense of comfort. Richard entered, surprising her. He seemed distracted, holding a folder of documents in his hand. "I didn't expect to find you here," he said, stopping in the middle of the room. "I didn't expect you to talk to me," she replied with a sarcastic smile. He frowned, but instead of responding immediately, he placed the folder on the table and sat down in a nearby armchair. "Are you settling in?" he asked, folding his arms. "I think so," she replied hesitantly. "But it still feels strange. It doesn't feel real." Richard leaned forward slightly. "It doesn't have to feel real. This is a contract, Stella, an agreement. I assure you, everything will go exactly as planned." "That's what you do, isn't it?" she said, her voice tinged with defiance. "You plan everything, calculate everything, leave no room for mistakes." He studied her for a moment, as if deciding whether to continue the conversation. That's how I've built everything I have. Planning prevents failure, he finally said. Stella gave a short, bitter laugh and shook her head. Sometimes failure is inevitable. You can plan everything, but you can't control how you feel, Richard. Her words seemed to strike a chord with him. He leaned back in the chair, silent. Stella noticed his reaction, but didn't press further. She simply picked up the book again and walked toward her room, leaving Richard alone to reflect. As the days passed, Stella adjusted to life in Richard's mansion. Despite the grandeur and comfort, she couldn't shake the feeling of being out of place. Every expensive piece of furniture and ornate decoration served as a constant reminder that this wasn't her world. Yet, she followed the routine, medical appointments, meals prepared by chefs, all while the emotional void within her grew. At night, when she was alone in her room, her thoughts turned to what she had left behind. It hadn't been much, but it had been all she knew. Now, everything felt uncontrollable. The question that lingered was the one she couldn't escape. What would it be like to carry a child, only to give it away? Stella tried to push away the unsettling thoughts that plagued her, but they lingered, especially in the quiet of the night. While she struggled with her inner turmoil, Richard observed her from afar. He kept his usual detached demeanor, but couldn't help feeling an increasing curiosity about her. It wasn't out of romantic interest, at least not yet, but a fascination he couldn't quite explain. One afternoon, after a full day of meetings, Richard found Stella sitting alone in the garden, gazing up at the sky. The serene scene was a stark contrast to the tough image he had of her. For a moment he hesitated, unsure whether to approach, but eventually walked over to her. "Enjoying the garden?" he asked, his tone as firm as always. Stella turned, startled, but quickly replied, "It's nice, definitely better than the streets." He sat down beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. There was something about Stella's blunt honesty that disarmed him. "Are you settling in?" he asked. Stella shrugged and glanced at the flowers nearby. "It still feels strange, like I'm living someone else's life." Richard was quiet for a moment before responding. "It's all part of the agreement. I want you to have everything you need so things go as planned." "As planned," she repeated with a hint of sarcasm. "Do you always live like this, planning every second of your life?" Richard looked at her, taken aback by the question. He was used to people accepting his decisions without challenge. "Planning is what keeps everything in place," he replied, his voice firm. "Without it, things fall apart." Stella gave a small smile and shook her head. "I don't think everything can be controlled. Sometimes things just happen, whether you want them to or not." Her words caught him off guard, unsettling him more than he expected. He stood up abruptly, ending the conversation. "If you need anything, let Stephanie know," he said, then turned and walked back into the house. A few days later, Richard decided to accompany Stella to one of her medical appointments. He told himself it was to ensure everything was going smoothly, but deep down, he felt a growing sense of responsibility for the situation. Stella wasn't surprised by his decision, but felt a quiet intrigue. At the doctor's office, after the usual exams, they heard the baby's heartbeat for the first time. Stella was unexpectedly moved, her eyes filling with tears. She quickly tried to hide it, but Richard remained still, his expression unreadable. Yet, there was something in his gaze that had shifted, a subtle change, as if the sound of the heartbeat had stirred something inside him he wasn't ready to face. "Everything looks perfect," the doctor said with a smile. "You can start planning the next steps, prenatal care, and what comes after." Stella nodded, but Richard stayed silent. The drive back to the mansion was filled with a heavy silence. Richard seemed lost in thought, and Stella couldn't find the right words to break the tension. When they arrived, Richard surprised her by opening the car door for her. "Thank you for today," Stella said as she stepped out. "It was the least I could do," Richard replied without meeting her gaze. "I'll ensure everything continues smoothly." Stella watched him walk into the mansion, his posture as composed as always, but there was something different about him. Maybe the sound of the baby's heartbeat had affected him, or maybe it was just her imagination. Over the next few days, Stella noticed small changes. Richard started appearing more often in the common areas, and their conversations, though still brief, felt less distant. He began asking about her appointments, her well-being, and even suggested activities to help her relax. One morning, Stella found a neatly wrapped package outside her room with a handwritten note, "To help with your free time." Inside was a new sketchbook and high-quality pencils. Stella was taken aback. She hadn't expected Richard to remember her casual mention of drawing. Later that evening, while she was in the garden, Richard passed by and paused for a moment. "Did you like the gift?" he asked nonchalantly. "Yes," Stella answered, holding the sketchbook close. "Thank you. I didn't expect this. It seemed like something that could be good for you," he shrugged. Stella smiled softly, holding the sketchbook tighter. "It was," she said simply. Despite the luxury and comfort of her new life, Stella couldn't shake the sense of disconnection. The mansion, with its vast halls and flawless design, felt like a fortress, isolating her from the outside world. Each day felt emptier than the last. She was physically there, but emotionally distant. Richard, however, continued his usual reserved behavior, but Stella began to notice fleeting moments where his cold, calculated facade slipped. There were glimpses of something deeper, as if the man behind the walls was almost human. One morning, Richard surprised her with an unexpected request. "I'd like us to talk after breakfast," he said, his tone more direct than usual. After their meal, Stella and Richard met in the sitting room. Richard stood near a stack of papers, his posture as rigid as ever. "I need to go over a few additional details of the contract," he began. Stella felt a tightness in her chest. "More details?" "I thought everything was settled," she replied, trying to keep her voice calm. Richard observed her closely. "It's nothing that changes the terms. I just want to make sure you understand what happens after the birth. I want to avoid surprises." Stella took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I think I understand. I leave, and you carry on with your life." He nodded but hesitated. "Yes, but if you need anything afterward, despite the agreement, I'll be here to help. I don't want you to feel abandoned." Stella raised an eyebrow, surprised. "That's unexpected coming from you," she said, a hint of sarcasm in her voice. Richard shrugged. "I don't want complications. This is the best way to avoid them." Stella chuckled, but something in his serious tone made her pause. Perhaps he was genuinely trying to show a different side of himself, even if he didn't quite know how. Later that day, Stella wandered through the mansion. The vastness of the house was overwhelming, with endless hallways and rooms filled with expensive artwork. At the end of one hallway, she noticed a small study with the door slightly open. Curious, she peeked inside and saw Richard seated at a desk, holding a framed photograph. He stared at it intently, his usually perfect posture now slumped. For the first time, he seemed vulnerable. Stella knocked softly, and Richard quickly set the photo down. "Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt," she said, her voice uncertain. Richard looked up, startled. "It's nothing," he said curtly, quickly putting on his neutral expression. "Did you need something?" "No," Stella answered, shifting awkwardly. "I was just exploring. You looked like you were thinking about something important." Richard paused before replying. "We all have things we'd rather keep to ourselves." Sensing his discomfort, Stella changed the subject. "This house is huge. Do you live here alone all the time?" He nodded, crossing his arms. "It's more practical than it seems. I don't like distractions, and here, I have the space I need." Stella studied him, puzzled. That must be strange, having all this but no one to share it with. Richard looked away, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm used to it. I don't need anyone to do what I do." Stella wanted to trust Richard's words, but something in his tone hinted at hidden emotions. Before she could reply, he stood up suddenly. "If you need anything, Stephanie can assist," he said, cutting the conversation short. That evening, Stella found herself on the mansion's terrace, staring out at the glittering city lights. The sound of the baby's heartbeat from the ultrasound kept echoing in her mind, a sound that had stirred emotions she hadn't expected. No matter how hard she tried to remain detached, it was becoming more difficult. Her thoughts were interrupted by footsteps. Turning, she saw Richard approaching. "You seem to like this spot," he remarked. "I like the silence," she replied. "It helps me think." He stood beside her, eyes fixed on the distant lights. "Thinking isn't always a good thing." Stella let out a soft laugh. "Tell that to someone who spends most of their time alone." Richard didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was softer. "Sometimes, being around people doesn't help much either." Stella glanced at him, sensing the sadness in his words. "Maybe you need something you can't control, Richard," she said, speaking her thoughts without restraint. Richard frowned, as if pondering a reply, but chose silence instead. He turned and walked away, leaving Stella to confront her own swirling emotions. The following week brought another checkup. Stella woke up early, filled with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. The thought of seeing the baby, even on a screen, made her heart race. At breakfast, she found Stephanie going over schedules with Richard. "Ready?" Richard asked, glancing up from his papers. Ready enough, Stella responded, hiding her nervousness. Good. We'll go together, he said, his tone firm. In the car, the silence was heavier than usual. Richard seemed deep in thought, though his exterior remained composed. At the doctor's office, they were greeted warmly. Stella lay down on the exam table as the doctor prepared the ultrasound equipment. We'll get a clearer view of the baby today, the doctor explained, adjusting the monitor. The cold gel on her abdomen made her shiver, and as the transducer moved over her skin, she held her breath, anxious about what she might see. Richard stood beside her, his arms crossed, eyes fixed on the monitor. Then the sound came, the steady rhythm of heartbeats. Not just one, but two. Well, here's the surprise we couldn't see last time, the doctor said, pointing to the screen. You're expecting twins. Lee's eyes widened in disbelief. Twins? It was a possibility she had never considered. A rush of emotions flooded her, a blend of shock and joy. She instinctively placed a hand on her belly, still processing the news. Richard stood quietly for a moment, his usual serious expression replaced with something new, genuine awe. He leaned slightly forward, his gaze fixed on the screen. Two, he asked, needing reassurance. Two, the doctor confirmed with a smile. Both are healthy and developing well. The room fell into a silence, only broken by the rhythmic sound of the heartbeats. For Leah, it was a magical moment. No matter how hard she tried to distance herself emotionally, she couldn't deny the connection she felt to the two lives growing inside her. Richard, standing by her side, seemed equally moved, though he said nothing. His eyes, however, conveyed something deeper. For the first time, he appeared vulnerable, touched by the thought of becoming a father to two children. On the drive back to the mansion, the silence between them was different. It no longer felt cold and distant, but held a certain weight. Leah decided to break it. You don't seem like the type to be surprised, she said lightly, hoping to ease the tension. Richard exhaled deeply, his gaze fixed ahead. I'm not, he said after a pause. But this? He glanced at her briefly before focusing back on the road. This is different. Leah studied him, curious. Richard rarely showed any vulnerability, yet he seemed lost in thought. Is it scary? She asked softly. He turned to look at her for a moment before replying, No. It's impressive, knowing that in a few months, two completely new lives will be here, depending on me. Lee's chest tightened. She knew she would have to let go of the babies eventually, but hearing Richard speak with such care made her realize just how connected she already was to them. They depend on me too, at least for now, she said, her voice betraying the emotion she was trying to hide. Richard nodded. I know, and that's why I want to make sure you're okay, Leah. Not just physically, but in every way. That matters to me. She fell silent, taking in his words. For the first time, he had spoken so sincerely about their shared situation. Later that evening, Leah stood on the terrace, gazing at the horizon. Richard approached, appearing more hesitant than usual, something that seemed rare for him. I can't stop thinking about what the doctor said today, he began, sitting next to her. Two babies. Two futures. Leah was taken aback by Richard's openness. It's a lot of responsibility, isn't it? She asked. Richard's gaze remained on the horizon as he replied, It's more than that. For the first time, I feel like something in my life can't be calculated. I can't predict who these two will become, and I can't control how they'll grow. Hearing this admission from Richard, a rare moment of vulnerability, sent a chill through Leah. She realized that, just like her, he was experiencing change, though he was doing so reluctantly. Sometimes that's a good thing, she said gently. Not knowing what's next. It can bring things you never expected. Richard looked at her, considering her words, slowly accepting that not everything in life could be controlled. In the following days, the news about the twins brought an unexpected sense of lightness to the mansion. Stephanie began adjusting the nursery to accommodate 2 cribs instead of 1. Leah watched the changes unfold with mixed emotions. She had agreed to give up the babies, but the reality of doing so was much harder than she'd anticipated. As the preparations continued, Leah and Richard both saw that the contract which had initially brought them together was becoming something more complicated. The twins, though still unborn, were already changing their lives in ways neither of them had predicted. Following the revelation, small yet significant shifts began to appear in Leah and Richard's interactions. Though he remained methodical and reserved, his gestures started to reveal a side of him that Leah hadn't expected. One afternoon, after a medical appointment, Richard insisted on escorting her to the car, a task he usually delegated to Stephanie or the staff. Are you okay? He asked, holding the car door open for her. Leah was taken aback by his concern. Yes, I'm fine. Thank you. On the drive back, their usual silence was broken when Richard asked, Is there anything you need? Anything that might make you more comfortable? Leah studied him, sensing something deeper in his inquiry. It didn't feel like a superficial question. There was genuine concern in his tone, though she wasn't yet sure how to interpret it. Nothing comes to mind right now, but thank you for asking, she replied carefully. He nodded and focused back on the road, but Leah couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing. Richard seemed to be showing real concern for her, despite her lingering doubts. When they arrived back at the mansion, Leah found new pillows and blankets in her room with a note attached. To help you rest better. She smiled, touched by the simple but meaningful gesture. Later, while sipping tea in the living room, Richard entered and quietly sat across from her. He seemed more relaxed than usual, though his serious demeanor remained. Leah was taken aback by Richard's honesty. It's a big responsibility, isn't it? She asked, trying to process his openness. Richard, eyes still on the horizon, replied, It's more than just responsibility. This is the first time I've felt that something in my life can't be controlled. I can't predict who these two will become. Leah shivered at his words, recognizing that admitting something beyond his control was a rare moment of vulnerability for Richard. She realized that, like her, he was changing, even if he didn't fully understand it. Sometimes, not knowing what's next can be a good thing, she said thoughtfully. It can lead to things you never expected. Richard looked at her, seemingly considering her perspective for the first time. For a moment, it felt like he was accepting that not everything could be planned. In the days that followed, the news of the twins brought a shift in the mansion. Stephanie made changes to the nursery to accommodate 2 babies, a task that both intrigued and unsettled Leah. The thought of giving up the babies, as per the agreement, was becoming harder to bear than she had expected. The contract, once a straightforward arrangement, was now complicating their lives in ways neither of them had anticipated. The twins, still unborn, had already begun to change the course of their relationship. Their interactions began to show subtle shifts. Richard, who was usually distant and reserved, started showing small signs of caring. After a medical appointment, he insisted on escorting Leah to the car, a gesture that was out of character for him. Are you okay? Richard asked as he opened the car door for her. Leah was surprised by the genuine concern in his voice. Yes, I'm fine. Thank you. On the drive back to the mansion, Richard asked, Is there anything you need? Anything that would make you more comfortable? Leah looked at him, sensing sincerity in his question. Nothing at the moment, but thank you for asking. Back at the mansion, Leah noticed more changes. A set of new pillows and blankets had been left in her room, accompanied by a note, To help you rest better. The small gesture made her smile, though she was still hesitant to fully trust Richard. Later, as she sipped tea in the living room, Richard entered and quietly sat across from her. He appeared more relaxed, yet still serious. Did you like what I left in your room? He asked bluntly. Leah nodded, a bit surprised by his directness. Yes, I did. It was thoughtful. I want to make sure you're comfortable, Richard said, his gaze steady. That's important to me. Leah frowned slightly. As much as she appreciated his gesture, a part of her still couldn't shake her mistrust. You're changing, Richard, she said, voicing her thoughts. But I still don't understand why. Richard paused, considering his response. Finally, he admitted, Maybe you're right. I don't know how to be different. I've never really cared before. His honesty caught both of them off guard. For the first time, Richard revealed a vulnerability that had always been hidden. Later that night, as Leah reflected on their conversation, she realized Richard wasn't the person she had initially thought him to be. There was something more human beneath his cold exterior, but whether that was good or bad, she wasn't sure. The next morning, Richard joined Leah for breakfast, an unusual occurrence. There's something I want to discuss, he said, his tone serious. Leah looked at him, curious. What is it? Richard hesitated before speaking. I know you don't trust me, and I understand why. I've never been good at trusting people, and because of that, I've become someone who's hard to deal with. Leah stayed quiet, letting him continue. I've learned not to depend on anyone, not to let anyone get close enough to hurt me. But with you, with what we're building, I've started to think I might be wrong. Leah blinked, surprised by his openness. We all have our barriers, she said softly. But that doesn't mean we have to hide behind them forever. Richard nodded, considering her words. Maybe you're right, but changing isn't easy for me. Leah smiled slightly. No one said it would be easy. Later that day, Richard joined her for a walk in the garden. They spoke about small, insignificant things at first, but the conversation eventually returned to the babies. "Have you thought about names?" he asked, catching her off guard. Stella hadn't yet thought about names for the babies. When Richard asked, she was surprised by his suggestion that they should decide together. For a moment, she realized that he was trying to be more present and open, which caught her off guard. While she still kept her guard up, she couldn't ignore that he was making an effort. As the sun set, they sat on a bench in the garden, watching the sky's warm colors. Stella mused aloud, "I never imagined I'd be here, doing something like this." Richard responded with a slight smile, "Neither did I. But maybe this is exactly where we need to be." For the first time, Stella saw him begin to let down his guard. Maybe, just maybe, what had started as a contract was evolving into something much bigger. The following morning felt routine for Stella, despite the physical toll of her pregnancy. Richard was in his office, absorbed in paperwork. Their usual interactions were becoming a quiet comfort for both. But that day, things took an unexpected turn. Just before lunch, Stella felt a sharp pain, one that was different from the usual pregnancy discomforts. She tried to dismiss it, but the pain grew more intense. When she couldn't ignore it any longer, she called for Stephanie, who quickly realized the seriousness of the situation. "Richard needs to know about this," Stephanie said, helping Stella sit down. "This could be the start of labor." Stella nodded, but another wave of pain hit, leaving her struggling to breathe. Stephanie rushed to find Richard, who appeared shortly after. The sight of Stella in distress shook him, and for once, his normally stoic face softened with genuine concern. "Stella, what's happening?" he asked urgently. "I think it's happening," she gasped, realizing that the babies were coming. For a moment, Richard was frozen in shock, but he quickly regained composure. He grabbed his phone, ordering the car to be ready and instructing Stephanie to gather everything for the hospital. "We're going now," he said, his voice firm yet filled with an unfamiliar urgency. The ride to the hospital was a blur of emotions for both of them. Stella focused on managing the pain, while Richard, sitting beside her, was torn between anxiety and determination. As he held her hand, his grip steady yet reassuring, he said, "We're almost there. You'll be okay. We'll be okay." Though Stella didn't respond, she felt comforted by his words. At the hospital, things moved swiftly, thanks to Richard's careful preparations. Stella was immediately taken to the delivery room, with Richard insisting on staying by her side despite the staff's attempts to have him wait outside. "I'm staying," he declared firmly, holding her hand. The hours that followed were filled with a tense, emotional energy as Richard watched Stella's strength while she gave birth to their twins. The process felt endless but was charged with intensity. Eventually, the first cry broke the silence, a small yet powerful sound that filled the room. "A boy," the doctor announced, smiling as the baby was placed on a nearby table. Richard's heart raced as he took in the sight of his son. Before he could fully absorb the moment, another cry echoed through the room. "A girl," the doctor added, his sister. Exhausted but glowing with joy, Stella looked at her babies, knowing the time with them would be brief. Richard stood still for a moment, watching the doctor work. Then, as if moved by something deep inside, he took Stella's hand and said, "You were incredible." "Thank you." Tears streamed down Stella's face, but she couldn't tell if they were from happiness, relief, or the heartbreak of knowing what was to come. When the babies were handed to her, Leah held them tenderly, studying every tiny detail, their closed eyes, their tiny fingers. The overwhelming love she felt was undeniable, and she realized it would be impossible to leave them without carrying a piece of them forever. Richard remained by her side, silently moved by the moment. When he held their son, his usual stern expression softened in a way Leah had never seen before. It was clear that this wasn't just about heirs or legacy. He was connecting to something pure, something beyond his control. When he held his daughter, he closed his eyes for a brief moment, as if trying to ingrain the moment in his memory. When he opened his eyes, he looked at Leah with an expression of sincere gratitude. "They're perfect," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Leah nodded, still cradling the boy. Tears flowed freely now, but she didn't mind. That night, as Leah rested in her room, Richard stayed with the babies in the observation area, watching them sleep. A surge of emotions he didn't know how to process overwhelmed him. For the first time, he realized that these children weren't just part of a plan. They represented a connection to something much larger, true love. Stephanie arrived with coffee and gently asked, "Mr. Lewis, is everything all right?" Richard glanced at her, struggling to find the right words. For the first time in a long while, I think it is, he said softly. Stephanie gave him a small smile before leaving Richard to contemplate the moment with his children. Meanwhile, Leah awoke in her room, overwhelmed with loneliness. Though she loved the babies deeply, the contract still overshadowed everything. She knew they wouldn't be hers for much longer, and the weight of that thought pressed on her heart. But when Richard entered, carrying both babies, something within her shifted. He looked different, as though the moment had altered not just his relationship with the twins, but his connection to her. He sat beside her, handed her the boy, and kept the girl in his arms. I don't know how, but this changes everything, he confessed, looking down at the twins. Leah nodded, understanding that no matter what happened next, this moment would stay with her forever as a miracle. Months later, the mansion was filled with a heavy, silent atmosphere. Leah knew what today meant. The weeks following the twins' birth had been filled with both joy and heartache. She loved them more than she ever thought possible, but the terms of the contract remained. Her time with them was ending. Today, she would have to leave. As she packed her few belongings into a small suitcase, Leah looked at the babies sleeping peacefully in their cribs. Tears welled up, but she fought them back. She didn't want her last memories of this place to be clouded by sadness. She reminded herself that she had made an agreement and had to stick to it. Stephanie knocked gently and entered with a concerned look. Is everything ready? She asked quietly. Leah nodded, swallowing hard. Yes. Thank you for everything. Stephanie hesitated before speaking. Are you sure this is what you want? It seems like there's something more between you and Mr. Lewis. Leah forced a smile, though her heart was heavy. It's not about what I want. It's about honoring the agreement. Stephanie didn't push further. She left the room, telling Leah she would inform Richard that she was ready to leave. When Leah came downstairs, suitcase in hand, she found Richard waiting by the front door. He wasn't the same cold, calculating man she had met before. He now seemed vulnerable, as if losing something important. Everything's ready, Leah said, breaking the silence. Richard didn't answer immediately. He took a step toward her, his voice barely above a whisper. Are you really leaving? Leah felt a lump in her throat, but stood firm. That was the deal. I've done my part. Now it's time to move on. Richard stood motionless for a moment before pulling the contract from his coat pocket, holding it casually in his hand as though it were unimportant. This contract, he began, his voice now steady, should never have defined what's between us. Before Leah could respond, Richard ripped the paper into pieces, letting them fall to the floor with a sound that echoed through the foyer, like a declaration of change. I don't want you to leave, Leah. I don't want this to end. Leah froze, her gaze locked on the scattered pieces of paper. Her heart pounded, but fear and pain kept her from reacting. Richard, tearing up a contract doesn't change everything. It's not that simple. He stepped closer, his expression filled with emotion. I know it's not simple. Nothing about this has been. But the last few months have shown me something I never had the courage to admit. I need you, Leah. Not just because of the twins, but because you brought something into my life I never knew I needed. Her heart ached at his words, but she shook her head, trying to resist. How do I know this is real? How can I trust that you won't change your mind, pull away when things get tough? Richard paused, struggling to find the right words. Because I've tried living without feeling anything for anyone, and it left me empty. You taught me that I don't need to be afraid of connecting, of being human. And yes, it scares me, but I don't want to lose this. Lose you. Tears welled in Lee's eyes, but she remained guarded. I fell in love with you, Richard, she confessed, her voice trembling. But you don't understand how hard it is to trust again. I've been abandoned, ignored my whole life. How can I believe you won't do the same? Richard stepped closer, his breath warm against her skin. Because you changed everything for me. I'm not a man who says that lightly. I don't know how to prove it, but I'll try every day for the rest of my life, if you give me the chance. His words struck deep, breaking through the walls she had carefully built. Despite the risks, she wondered if it was worth facing them. What if it doesn't work out? She whispered. Taking her hands, Richard met her gaze, his voice steady. Then we'll keep trying, no matter how many times it takes. I won't give up on you. In that moment, the world seemed to pause. Leah felt her doubts start to fade, replaced by a spark of hope. She realized that Richard was truly willing to let go of his fears and be with her. With a soft nod, she allowed her tears to fall freely. Okay, I'll stay. Richard sighed in relief, pulling her into a tight embrace. For the first time, Leah felt certain that this was where she belonged. At Richard's mansion, the day began with a soft serenity. Stella woke to the quiet sounds of the twins in the nursery next door. It felt different that morning. For the first time in ages, she didn't feel the burden of uncertainty or the pressure of a contract. She had chosen to stay, and Richard had chosen to open his heart, allowing them to build something together. Stella went to the nursery, where the twins were awake, cooing softly in their cribs. She leaned over to gently stroke their cheeks, whispering words of affection. Before she could lose herself in the moment, she heard footsteps behind her. It was Richard, standing in the doorway with a slight smile. His eyes, once distant and controlled, were now filled with something Stella could only define as love. "Good morning," he said, entering the room and picking up the baby boy. "I never thought this moment would feel so natural," he murmured, almost to himself. Stella smiled, watching Richard as he embraced his new role as a father. It was deeply fulfilling to see him so devoted to the twins. The weeks that followed were filled with adjustments. Though inexperienced, Richard made an effort to learn, helping Stella with the babies. He fumbled through diaper changes, fed them bottles, and even attempted to sing lullabies, despite his rough voice. For Stella, his dedication proved that he was changing. One evening, as they sat on the couch with the twins sleeping nearby, Richard turned to her, his expression serious. "I've been thinking about something," he said. "What is it?" Stella asked, curious. He took a deep breath. "I want us to be a real family. Not just because of the twins, but because I want you by my side forever." Stella was silent, taken by surprise. She had known their feelings for each other were growing, but hearing him say it out loud was unexpected. "Richard, this is a big step," she replied, processing his words. "Are you sure?" He took her hands, looking into her eyes. "I've never been more sure. I know things won't be easy, and I made mistakes, but I want to build something with you. Not based on contracts or obligations, but on love." His sincerity touched her deeply. Tears filled Stella's eyes as she nodded. "I want that too." Richard smiled, relief washing over him. A few weeks later, an intimate ceremony took place in the mansion's gardens. Only a few close people were invited, including Stephanie and other staff members who had become part of their journey. The day was perfect, with the sun shining and a gentle breeze rustling through the flowers that decorated the venue. Stella wore a modest yet graceful dress, while Richard looked dashing in his suit. The twins, dressed in cute outfits, were lovingly held by Stephanie, who was visibly emotional with joy. When Richard and Stella exchanged vows, they spoke with sincerity. Richard promised to be the man Stella deserved, always standing by her side, while Stella vowed to trust him and help him become the best version of himself. At the end of the ceremony, as they embraced each other with the twins in their arms, Stephanie commented, "You make a beautiful family," and it was undeniable. For the first time, Richard, Stella, and the twins were exactly where they were meant to be. Life continued with its usual challenges, but also with moments of happiness. Richard and Stella worked together to build a loving home for their children, navigating sleepless nights and constant needs with a mix of exhaustion and joy. One evening, as Stella was settling the babies to sleep, Richard appeared at the door and silently embraced her. Stella rested her head against him as he whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me." "Thank you for showing me I could trust again," she responded. Months later, on a sunny afternoon, Richard and Stella sat together in the garden, watching the twins play on a soft mat in the grass. Their laughter filled the air, bringing an infectious joy. Stella turned to Richard and asked, "Are you happy?" He looked at her and then at the twins, answering, "I never thought I could be this happy. You've given me more than I ever knew I needed. A family, a purpose, love." Stella smiled, feeling a sense of peace. "And you've shown me that love can be built, even through challenges. Thank you for that." As they shared a gentle kiss, the twins babbled mama and dada. Overcome with emotion, Richard and Stella laughed, moving closer to their children and enveloping them with all their love. In that simple, unassuming moment, they knew they had found something real. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was filled with love, understanding, and hope, everything they needed to move forward. What are your thoughts on Richard's actions? Feel free to share your opinion in the comments. How would you rate this story on a scale from 0 to 10? Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications to stay updated on new content. Also, be sure to check out more heartwarming stories by clicking the link on the end screen.